Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this session of the Oxford Media Convention. I'm Caris Roberts, and I'm Executive Director here at IPPR. Today and this afternoon, we're going to be discussing platforms and publishers, how to forge a fairer relationship. And what we'll be discussing in this session is the rise of digital platforms in the way in which that the public accesses and discovers new content, and some of the impacts of this. So, for instance, the impacts that this has on discoverability and the revenues that are generated through advertising, and the implications of shifts in that for sustainable journalism. We've got a really brilliant set of speakers today. We have Lord Putnam, who is chair of the Lords Democracy and Digital Technologies Committee. We have Michelle Marr, co-founder of the Balanced Economy Project and senior policy fellow at UCL. She is a former competition lawyer and author of Competition is Killing Us, which is a book that I'd very much recommend. We have Emma Meese, Director at the Centre for Community Journalism at Cardiff University and the Independent Community News Network. And we have Hugh Millwood, who's General Manager of Corporate, External and Legal Affairs at Microsoft. We're going to be hearing from each of our speakers for 5 minutes or so for their reflections on this important topic. And we're then going to be opening up a discussion. So I'll have some questions, but I'd also like to take as many questions as possible from the audience today. So please do make sure that you're submitting those. And then before we get started, I just wanted to thank Microsoft, who have sponsored this session today and made the conversation possible. So without further ado, we'll go straight into each of our speakers to offer some opening reflections on this topic. And I'd like to start with Michelle.
Thank you very much, Caris, for that kind introduction. I'll be just sharing a few remarks today and a few observations on the kind of state of play in relation to the kind of regulation, particularly of big tech, and in relation to the publishers. But I wanted to start by acknowledging that this is a really important conversation. And in this case today, it's made possible by the funding of Microsoft. And I think this is important to note because due respect to my fellow panelists coming from Microsoft, but Microsoft, in previous life was, one of the monopolists against which a lot of these conversations would be kind of happening around antitrust enforcement directed at Microsoft. And now Microsoft is obviously in a very different stage, but there's very little funding actually that is promoting these kinds of very important conversations, the kind that we're going to have today. And I just want to acknowledge that there's very little funding out there, and that sometimes the funding around the conversations might shape the types of conversations we have. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. Another point is it's really a more of a question, a kind of a curiosity of mine, which is that the media itself has been kind of the harshest critic in a way of many of these, the way that the industry has developed, particularly around big tech. And I have a curiosity around whether it's the case that we have the same level of rigorous criticism as we did before the various publishers struck deals with the platforms. So I've heard rumblings that it might be more difficult to put forward a story at The Guardian, for example, if you want to go after Google. I don't know if that's true, but I'd be very curious to know whether that's the experience others are having. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the consultation that was issued by the government yesterday. There was a broad consultation around competition and consumer policy and a narrower consultation around digital markets. I'll focus on the second since that's most relevant to what we're talking about today. At the outset of this document, I think it's really important to acknowledge the tone with which the government is approaching these problems. So the kind of rhetoric we see is that the government is unashamedly pro-tech. It wants to be the most innovative, pro-enterprise government ever. They want digital-driven growth to fuel our recovery and leveling up. And I think this is all great. This is all a fantastic kind of language, but this is all being dressed in the language of competition. And the reason why this is important is because competition can mean different things to different people. So you and I can say competition and we can have a very different vision of the market in our minds. And critically, when the government was asked to kind of, or is consulting on the statutory duty that will sit behind the new digital markets unit. So what is the motivating factor that will motivate intervention by the digital markets unit? They've decided, or they're leaning towards a promotion of competition statutory duty that would kind of veer away from the recommendations to include citizens within the remit, or a kind of broader public interest. And this is critical because it's also the threshold in which the pro-competitive interventions would be applied. That's if there's an adverse effect on competition. So we're relying on competition to serve the kind of public benefit. And I think that we need to think very carefully about whether it is the case that the kind of competition that a competition authority or the Digital Markets Authority might conceive of, is that the kind of competition that we want to see? And it may sound like I'm nitpicking here, that this is a kind of difference of emphasis, but I think it's actually really important, because what we don't really see is a criticism of the commercialization of data, threats to democracy, concentration of wealth and power being seen as a threat to society per se. And I think we see a very different tone when we look at the what's coming out of the US in terms of how they're approaching their digital markets regulation. I'm probably kind of running out of time here, but just to say that, you know, a lot of the devil will be in the detail. How detailed will the code be? That's a new battleground for the companies that will be designated as strategic market status. And I think that we need to be thinking very carefully about whether, you know, for example, some of the framing around the digital markets unit is that it will be a forward-looking unit. Are we so deep now that we actually should think about unwinding some of what has already happened? So just to contrast with what's happening in the US, it's a different institutional setup, many of the same proposals actually, but a very different thrust and motivation, which is really looking at breakups, it's looking at reversing previous mergers, it's looking at a much kind of higher standard of scrutiny. And we could, you know, if we're in a kind of very nascent stage now with our consultation, we could end up somewhere like there. That's where I would like to encourage us to go, but it will be kind of up to these kinds of conversations to really push it in that direction. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the remarks from my fellow panelists.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and plenty of food for thought there straight away. So I'll move now on to Hugh.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. And thanks for those comments, Michelle. Really super interesting as well. Just a couple of observations really from my perspective. People really now have access to more information than they've ever done before. And technology connects people with information. Services like Facebook, and I should just, at this point, just emphasize the fact that I'm not speaking on behalf of the tech industry in any way. I'm speaking on behalf of Microsoft, and I just so that's really clear. Services like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube mean that information is pretty ubiquitous. You know, I remember the days when I used to commute to work. I mean, I think some of us are still doing that, but for me, it feels like a long time ago. And the joys of Southern Rail and Thameslink were very often interrupted by a plethora of issues. And inevitably, the most immediate source of information about what was actually happening was through Twitter. Someone somewhere knew something and was sharing it. But it's not news, it's information. The quality, curated, and edited sources of high quality journalism and of analysis and opinion, empowered to seek the truth, to investigate and uncover the hidden or the obscure, published and be damned for it, is in demise. And having a strong, in particular, local media fulfills two incredibly important functions. The first is that it's society building. It creates a strong sense of a local sense of itself, I suppose, for a locality, an identity, nurturing people who care about each other. And secondly, local media supports democracy. You know, whether it's covering UK county courts, whether it's magistrates' courts, whether it's local authorities, you know, fundamentally they're holding decision makers to account. And research conducted in the US, but broadly applicable, suggests that areas without a local news service also are correlated with lower voting rates, less community engagement, and increased borrowing by local government. So where do we go from here? We can't wind the clock back, even if we wanted to. Local journalism fulfilled a need supported by an operational market, and that market no longer works. Ubiquitous access to information makes a paid for model deeply challenging, and the absence of ad revenue makes a free or subsidized model equally hard. And local media fulfilled a need, providing local news to local people who had no alternative means of finding it. And my local town of Brighton once had an evening paper as well as a morning paper. But this need is now fulfilled by tech platforms. Is media an anachronism, no longer fulfilling a need? I don't actually have any solutions. I'm going to fess up right now, but we do think that the debate is absolutely necessary, as Michelle has already mentioned. And if something workable emerges, we really do want to get behind it. And by workable, we think that there are some principles that will probably be important. News organizations should be paid a fair share of the money their work generates. The value of news should probably be negotiated. Collective bargaining is probably a good idea to put more leverage in the hands of smaller news outlets. Final offer arbitration of the kind that we've seen in Australia makes sense if parties really can't reach any other kind of agreement. Non-retaliation prevents dominant players from abusing their market position of the kind that Michelle, you mentioned a little earlier in respect of The Guardian. And transparency around issues like algorithm changes that impact news referrals are essential. But as a final word, I think there's probably more that every company could probably do to support local news, especially given that most companies have a headquarters, they have operations, they have investments, or they have larger numbers of people somewhere in a locality. And how they put that to work and how they engage with their own local media could actually be very effective. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I very much look forward to the debate.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Very interesting comments. We'll turn now to Emma.
I was nodding furiously, Michelle and Hugh. I was kind of, and I'm making myself even hotter in this heat by nodding so furiously. Yeah, thank you. So I just want to start a little bit by agreeing wholeheartedly with what he was saying there. We should be putting some more money back into the hands of smaller news publishers. And when I say put money back in, I think we need to start looking at actually giving money and funneling money back to the sources of good quality news journalism. I think the issue that we have, and obviously I would say that as a director of community journalism at Cardiff University, but for me just to qualify why I'm saying that. So I set up the Centre for Community Journalism at Cardiff University 9 years ago because we could see this new emerging landscape of these grassroots green shoot news publications. And the head of school at the time, Professor Justin Lewis, was going to conferences globally and everybody were wailing about the death of local journalism, going, oh, what are we going to do? And we decided at the university to focus our our money and our time and attention on these new grassroots publications and see, well, what can we do to build? Can we build strong foundations for us to? It's a different landscape, but it doesn't have to be the same. If you'd have asked people years ago what do they want, they would have said faster horses because they hadn't thought of cars. And I feel that what we're doing at the moment is we're regurgitating, we're trying to prop up what we've already got. We're putting scaffolding and some wobbly bricks, like you see these when you go on these foreign holidays and you see these builders, I think, how on earth are they still staying up? And I think we just need a completely new, refreshed look. So one reason I'm saying that is the biggest part of my job over the last 9 years has been trying to get a level playing field for smaller independent news publishers. So if you start thinking of them as new businesses, so start thinking of them as startup businesses. But in news, for some reason, we don't think of them as startup businesses in the same way as we would a shop or a greengrocer or a tech company. They don't get the same kind of allowances for being a startup business. They're seen as not being profitable, not being big enough, and therefore they're not successful. When you look at the statistics in terms of reach and engagement, and going back to what Hugh was saying there about, the need for local communities, we have never ever seen more want, need and appetite for local news than we have since the COVID era. People obviously interested in what's happening globally, but when they open their front door, they want to know what happens to my life, what happens to my family, am I risking life and limb by walking out my front door? I want to know, can I go to my doctor's surgery? When is my children's school reopening? When is the leisure centre going to stop being used as a makeshift morgue? Am I safe if I go on the bus? Which supermarkets are the ones to steer clear from? from social distancing. So there's this massive appetite and a want and a need for local news and information, and it impacts local health, it impacts democracy, it impacts everything. But we're still not seeing the money coming down. And one prime example of this was the UK government's Hand, Face, Space campaign. So we're all in agreement, we live in a digital era. Anybody that still says the future's digital are way past it, we are in a digital era. However, the Hand, Face, Space campaign was being published only in printed news titles. So where's the sense in this? People couldn't access newspapers. There were bans across the UK on paper boys and paper girls for a long time because they didn't know the impact on public health of handling the newspapers. So I was sitting on government meetings with all the larger news publishers saying, we can't, people are not going to bus stops, they're not going to train stations, they're not picking up our papers where they would normally get them. We can't get them delivered. And yet the public health campaign was in, you had to be a daily or a weekly printed news title. So to me, this is just crazy. We represent at the Independent Community News Network, which we set up a few years ago in response to these kinds of conversations where we're talking about small publishers, but they were very small and they were speaking with a lone voice. So what we've done is we've created a representative body, which is ICNN, and we currently I represent 128 independent news publishers. And we have very strict and stringent entry criteria. So in terms of quality and standards, it's harder to be a member of ICNN than it is to be a member of the NUJ. And that then affords me the assurance when I'm speaking on behalf of the sector that if you deal with our members, you are dealing with quality and reputable news publishers. But only one out of our 128 members could publish the Hands, Face, Space campaign because they were the only ones that had a daily or a weekly newspaper. So some of them are fortnightly, some are monthly, but majority are digital. And then the government and the Cabinet Office and Omnigov with the media buying partners are all saying, but we've invested a lot in digital. And then I'm seeing ads popping up on Pinterest and I'm seeing ads popping up on Twitter, and nothing going to these hardworking individuals and small organisations that are breaking their backs every single day to provide good quality news and information that are tackling the democratic deficit, and in my eyes are the future foundations for a strong and healthy democratic news service. So we need to start now having these conversations across the board. If our own government are still putting things during a global pandemic, but in health messaging in printed only titles, then what hope is there for the rest of us in terms of competition, as Michelle has spoken so eloquently about? We're not in a level playing field here, so we're not access to statutory notices, we don't have access to government health spending. So that's a huge percentage of income that goes to larger news organisations and doesn't go anywhere near. And when we're talking about the big tech companies, it's almost crumbs that we get. So it's really important when we look at things like verification. So getting access to a blue tick is really important. And then the big tech companies come back and say, they've got a grey tick. Yes, but that's not a media company. And from my understanding, there's a weighted importance that during a breaking news situation, if you are verified as a media organisation, then your stories will get surfaced. With Google, primarily our members break stories, then larger news organizations will pick up on those stories. Because they're bigger, they get more of the Google juice. So these are the things that we need to address, is how do we get this level playing field? I'm going to get off my soapbox. I could and I can and I do talk about this all day, and I'm really looking forward to lots of questions and hearing what everybody else has to say.
Thanks, Emma. And I particularly like your point about not just looking for faster horses. I think that's a very good analogy. Brilliant. We will now hear from Lord Putnam. I think you're on mute.
How's that? Am I okay now? Sorry.
Brilliant.
God, I thought I got past that now. Let me throw a few grenades into the things. First of all, Michelle, I think, was hinting at, and I think and I'm delighted she was, that the digital market unit is going to be as good as how well it's led. The government have said that the legislation will come forward as soon as the parliamentary time is available, which could mean a year, could mean 2 years. I have zero trust in the amount of energy we put behind it. I'm looking at a broader issue, if I may. I think that the resolutions and solutions are much more likely to come from the US through Lena Khan, or from Europe through Vestager and the people around Vestager. I'm very troubled by the continual inability to find a chairman for Ofcom. I'm troubled by the inability to find a new ICO following Elizabeth Denham. And all these things, I think, are straws in the wind. And what I'd say to Hugh is the following. Hugh used a really interesting phrase, society building. I think that is probably what's going on. But I think that Tories have got a very specific society that they're interested in building. And it's not one that I find particularly attractive. And if you give you a few examples, the next session today is going to be the privatization of Channel 4. Why? Why? There will not be, I promise you, when everything emerges, will not be an economic justification. This is a cultural attack. What will they do? They'll move part of the remit of Channel 4 onto the BBC, putting the BBC under additional pressure because they wish, I think, to move that time. Just, it may sound, Gareth, I hope it doesn't like a strange one to throw in, but I'm very involved at the moment with the battle over the future of teacher training, in initiative teacher training, which the government want to mandate in a way that, frankly, it runs a coach and horses through any idea of academic independence. So there's a lot of straws in the wind that would indicate to me that the government is trying to pull towards it all sorts of powers. And what it's doing them is under the guise of competition and market-driven policy. Now, I'll give you an example of how the democratic deficit can emerge from competition policy. I can find nobody who will explain to me the benefits that emerged from the consolidation of ITV in 2004. Nobody. I was on the chair of Anglia Television for 20 years. We had all sorts of very, very specific duties, one of which was to provide a weekly political program whereby all local MPs over a period of around a month to 6 weeks would be on air discussing what they felt with their constituents, what they felt. And the same was true in all the regions. I checked on Google just before we came on there. Only one tiny regional broadcaster ever went bankrupt in 1963, one. So what was wrong with the system that created the impetus to consolidate around ITV? Again, what it was trying to do, I believe, is dismantle voices, and we ended up with a very clear democratic deficit. So individual regions around the UK no longer hear from their own MPs, and MPs most backbenchers are invisible. And I don't think that's a good thing. The reason I come at this, with quite strong feelings, as you can probably tell, after 77,000 words and a year's evidence on the Democracy Committee we put together, it was no accident that I called it the resurrection of trust. I was originally going to call it the restoration of trust, but trust had been eroded so far that we were beyond the restoration point, and the only word I could come up with that worked was resurrection. We've got an immense job to do to begin to bring back a sense of trust in the provision of information. And for me, the concept of market power being within the idea of information provision, it's wrong. That's what drove me and colleagues of mine towards the idea of the public interest test in 2003. It's what drove us towards the duty of care in 2012. It's what drove us towards the report that we did last year. There's something going on, and unfortunately, because we tend to be specialists, and I'm not, Gareth will have a view on this, because we tend to be specialists, we lose the overview. We cease to see that there's actually a pattern in all of this. And that pattern is, back to your phrase, Hugh, that pattern is a form of society building, which has got nothing to do with the democratic society that I originally entered, both as a young citizen and as a parliamentarian. And I'll stop there for a minute.
And thank you very much for drawing our attention to that bigger picture. And indeed, that is the theme of this year's Oxford Media Convention, to look at democracy and trust and the relationship with the media. So I think it's really important that we do so. Please do keep submitting your questions so that we can take as many as possible and have a discussion about things that you'd like to raise. I want to start with one which perhaps, well, for each of you in different ways. So we've heard there quite a kind of pessimistic view about the government's approach to competition from several speakers about what their approach and whether that's going to really counter some of the problems that we see. Can we put the genie back in the bottle? And what hopes do you have of achieving that with this current government? And where are the kind of opportunities to shift that agenda? I might start with Michelle, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, yes, I mean, as Lord Putnam has said, I think that the likelihood we're not going to see this legislation this year. This consultation process runs until the 1st of October. I imagine there'll be a few months after that, and at earliest we will get something next year, but it's no guarantee. So in terms of kind of urgency, as the world continues to move on, the regulatory regime kind of falls further and further behind, which is why I think that one of my major concerns is whether the government has had a real understanding of how far the horse has already bolted, and whether the measures that are designed to be put in place kind of acknowledge that sufficiently, the kind of the largeness of the task. Because effectively what we need to be able to do is disable the kind of positive feedback loops that allow the biggest players to grow bigger. And this is exactly to Emma's level playing field point. And there are points within the DMU consultation which the government kind of could go in that direction, but is currently pulling its punches. So when it's looking at, for example, the merger review that may take place for strategic market status companies, it's looking at a kind of slightly changing the current burden of proof so that it's a slightly kind of stricter level of scrutiny, but it's not as far as, for example, reversing the burden of proof, which would require companies to actually prove that their merger benefits the public, or whatever the criteria become, rather than the other way around. I think that kind of ties in a little bit to the kind of broader pattern and the bigger picture that Lord Putnam was describing, because those kind of media consolidation, we've seen consolidation right across industry, across the whole of the UK economy. We see now the kind of later stages of that consolidation, where you get UK companies being kind of picked over by private equity as the kind of next investor in line. We've seen that with Asda, and we see it in the news about Morrison's. So I mean, that is the kind of overall direction of travel. And in relation to this particular kind of sector, I'm not seeing a kind of level of ambition in terms of the regulation. It may be that when we have regimes set up by the US and in the EU, that the UK can kind of fall under those shadows. But the reality is that they will not solve our problems for us. We are very much outside of their jurisdictions, and it wouldn't be surprising if, for example, US tech companies were to require some kind of negotiation as part of a US UK trade deal that requires kind of a softer approach in relation to them. So they might break them up in the US. That will not necessarily break them up here. So I think that's just kind of the background context that we need to be aware of.
Thanks, Michelle. And Hugh, I wonder if you could comment next, and in particular, maybe picking up on Michelle's point about the changes taking place in other countries. What do you think the implications are for the UK's path forward?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mean, Michelle also referenced this in you mentioned in your opening remarks how Microsoft is a bit battle scarred from some of these kind of issues, and that's true, and it actually has helped us to get a bit of perspective on some of these things as well, and so I don't think it would surprise you to hear that that we don't think that for the most part the DMU and the proposals within the Competition Markets Authority, particularly with regard to local news, are going far enough, and we really do think that they should go considerably further. As everyone has agreed, they should go a lot faster. As I think most people would also agree, is that as we get to greater levels of specialization in our regulators, including the Competition Markets Authority, but also Ofcom and other regulatory bodies, actually we're looking at a skill set that is in greater demand, and we have to have these bodies if they're going to perform these incredibly important functions of regulating the way in which we access and understand our own democracy. Then they've got to have the skills, they've got to have the resources to be able to do that effectively. And at the moment, I'm hoping that will be the case. And I've been, in every interaction I have with any of them, including government, I've been calling for the right level of resources to enable them to do that job effectively. But I think, in some respects, we've seen this with some of the European legislation, and certainly looking at what's happening in the US. determining how to define SMS, we really think that there should be a kind of two-pronged definition of those with digital platforms with market power protected by significant or very strong barriers to entry. So you've got this focus on where there is a inverted commas natural monopoly, and making sure that we've got a very, very strong focus on that market power, but also on platforms which control access to a unique set of users or platform participants. Very, very important that we get that right. I'm not quite sure we've got that right at a European level, but I think, again, it's progress. It's making progress in the right kind of direction. But we certainly do want to get this right in the UK, and we've got to move further. We've got to move faster.
Thanks. How about you, Emma? Where do you see the kind of the rays of light on this issue?
So apologies, I keep getting notifications saying unstable internet connection. So it was dipping in and out a little bit for me there. So I hope it stays on for this. I think I heard you say, but is it too late to put the genie back in the bottle earlier? And I think it is too late. And do we really want to put the genie back in? Because we're all about progress and moving forward. And again, are we trying to kind of go back and repackage what we had before when your days gone by? And I think there are rays of light. There's an organisation such as ours that exists now in order to have conversations on behalf of smaller publishers. So this is something that even 2 years ago didn't exist. So at the moment, we're in a position in the UK where we are now being invited to sit at all the, sit at the top tables. I get to put my posh frocks on and sit at the important tables. But we're not yet at the stage where we're seeing huge amounts of action. So there's listening, there's nodding, and then there's still, but this is kind of what we were hoping to do anyway, so we'll kind of carry on doing it. So I think that's where I come in. I need to maybe shout a little bit louder, because they do say those who shout loudest get heard first. So just to put it into context a little bit, there was a recent Public Interest News Foundation, a PIMF news index. Is the first one they've done. They want to do one every year, just kind of look at the independent market. So anyone with a turnover of less than 2 million, and might I say that some of our publishers would like to have a turnover of more than 20,000, let alone reach of the 2 million, 56 independent publishers were surveyed, and they have a total reach of 10.1 million unique monthly visitors. So that's, not too shabby. That's not to be sniffed at, but generated a total amount of income from print and digital of just under 5.4 million. So if you put that in comparison to JPI Media, who are not that much further ahead in terms of unique monthly users at 14.8 million, so just under a third more, but generated a revenue of 88.2 million. So we can start to see this imbalance. And then we start to look at Reach then, PLC, so they had an average of 42.1 million unique monthly users, but a general revenue of an eye-watering £600 million. So that's when you put those statistics next to each other, you see reach, engagement, importance for democracy and communities, not that different. When it comes to income and monetary, any kind of revenue, miles apart. So there's a lot of work still left to be done there to kind of plug that gap. We've still got work to do with the tech companies as well, in terms of things like, Facebook is a US company. Their idea of community is so different to ours. So in order to access certain things within Facebook, you need to have 10,000 likes or fans or followers on your page. Well, we might be talking about hamlets and towns and communities of 2,000 people, and they might still have a reach of 4,000, which is double the area, which is amazing. It's hugely successful for a community. However, they don't tick that Facebook box of what a community looks like. So there's lots of conversation and dialogue to be had in terms of just what is community, what size, scale, importance, revenue. These are all conversations that we have to keep on having.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lord Putnam, I don't know if I unfairly characterised your view as optimistic, but could you comment on the path forward for the UK and where you do think there might be space for movement?
Yeah, I mean, several things, guys. I hope this is helpful. Maybe one of the questions that will come back at me is someone will explain to me what the public interest benefit from the consolidation of ITV is, because I'd love to learn. I'm always eager to learn. There was a brilliant debate. I'm sorry, you need someone as old as me to even say this, but there was a brilliant debate in 52, I think, over whether or not the second TV channel would go to ITV, which became ITV, an independent commercial channel, or the BBC. And the Labour Party supported the idea of it being a BBC Two, and the Conservative Party supported the idea of it being a commercial channel. Actually, the Conservative solution out of that debate was brilliant, and that was the creation of regional broadcasters. That debate is worth anyone's time. Michelle, I recommend it, reading now, because it absolutely got to the heart of what the provision of information was at that time. I'm not pretending it's now, but it basically was public service driven and looking for a way of building the as well commercial imperatives into it to drive, indeed it did, it drove audiences. I'd suggest two things are going to occur. They're going to both happen during the online safety bill, I think, which it's just going to pre-legislative scrutiny. Two big battlegrounds, and I think that the ramifications of these battlegrounds are very considerable. One is the issue of the individual rights, the individuals being able to complain, and the other is groups. I think the government will lose this. I think because I think, and again, there will be those on the call who know more about this than me, but if you try and pin it down to individuals, what will actually happen is disguised class action suits, because individuals will say, hold on a second, yes, I'm stepping forward, it's in my name, but I'm actually representing the entire Jewish community or these. So first of all, I think ultimately the government will be pushed back on that one. And that's going to be interesting. The other, almost more importantly, is the accountability framework. I've sat on enough boards to know now that if you really want to capture a board's attention, explain to them how personally liable they are for any problems at the company. And you really, really do grab people's attention. So the first question then comes up, well, how well insured are we? I would suggest that the Germans have got quite a good solution to this. Is they have different accountability frameworks at different levels in their companies. Is that until you can get at the individuals involved in making the decisions and stop parading the idea of a 10% of turnover fines, you're not actually going to solve the problem. It is individual decision makers making individual decisions, many, many times pushed by external shareholders. That's where the soft underbelly of all this lies. So I'd love to see a very, very lively discussion about the nature of accountability within the whatever emerges from the online safety bill. If we get correct accountability frameworks, you'll begin to actually make some serious dents into the problems we've got.
Very interesting suggestion. Hugh, I think you wanted to come in once more on this question.
Yeah, it was just one additional point I wanted to add, and it really kind of picks up on Emma's comments, which is that I think one strengthening of the CMA's powers could be introducing this idea of the ability for we've got to find a way of small new media organizations being able to have more power, frankly, to conduct the kind of negotiations that the bigger players are able to do. And so some form of collective bargaining or something like that, and maybe Emma, even the organization that you represent can form part of that. I mean, but there has to be some redressing of the power balance there, because at the moment it's too one-sided. And there's been this in Australia, they've got this negotiation, this sort of final arbitration mechanism that's based on the kind of negotiations you have in baseball, and maybe that's a model. Maybe it is. It's a bit alien to the way in which we've done things in the UK so far. But who cares? I mean, if something works, let's give it a try.
Karis, can I jump in because just answer directly, Hugh. We've been down that road, Hugh, and you can solve it. It was done through the terms of trade between Channel 4 and ITV with independent producers. What we had was a vast number of very, very fragile independent producers who would collapse if they didn't get their series or their program re-upped. And by turning the terms of trade around so that the independent producers own their own IP, they were able to A, bring in outside investment, and then B, consolidate, which was impossible. So if you look at the history of the terms of trade relating to ITV, then relating to independent production, and then apply that across into exactly what you're describing, I think there are some interesting lessons to be learned there.
Very interesting. And I'll let you have one final word, Emma, before we move on to the other questions.
just to put it into context, so with our 128 members, and we're growing, we grew our membership quite substantially during COVID, and we're continuing to grow, which is excellent. That we, if by my statistics, I did some, you know, in my loft during COVID times, where we were trying to work out, you know, well, what's the size?
I think we might have lost you there, Emma.
Yeah.
I think we might have to come back to Emma's comment later. So I'm quite keen to get to the questions. Is it quick, Michelle?
Yeah, just a kind of very quick comment on just to tie together some of the things that that Emma and Lord Putnam and Hugh have said, which is about kind of this redressing the balance, not just in the marketplace, but also in this kind of regulatory process. We've got some hints that the strategic market status categorization, there will be some consultation with stakeholders and with other parties around that. What we don't see is a kind of broader public engagement on these issues. So I noted that one of the very first things that Lena Khan did when she took her chairmanship at the Federal Trade Commission in the US is make their committee meetings public. So suddenly they were public. Members of the public could engage with them. They're allowed to give submissions to the commissioners. I don't know, maybe it's chaos. And there are some serious questions as to the extent to which civil society and the general public has the capacity to engage with a lot of these conversations, because actually much of this discussion has been happening behind kind of technocratic closed doors. You know, the question over what is the public interest benefit of the ITV consolidation, likely there was kind of very little analysis around that in terms of, you know, if it worked on the business terms, then it kind of worked, and that we've been in that zone for the last kind of 3 or 4 decades. So we've got kind of quite a long way to go. So I don't mean to kind of keep sounding kind of negative. It's more about understanding the kind of the scale of the problem ahead of us, so that we can effectively arm ourselves to deal with these issues. Otherwise, I fear that we'll kind of have another kind of busy regulatory body that will be kind of churning out all sorts of things, and then we'll in 5 years' time be saying, oh well, it's not working. And the reason it might not be working is because we didn't quite acknowledge the scale of the problem in the first place.
I think that would be a really exciting idea, although it would certainly break the mold, wouldn't it? Do we have you back, Emma? Would you like to finish the point you were making? In which case I'll move on and then we'll see when Emma's able to join us. We have a question here from Lucy Huberman, which is for Lord Putnam, which is why he thinks there is a lack of interest in the roles of chair at Ofcom and the ISO. And if you could comment more on the systemic problems in the network of organisations working in this arena.
I think in terms of, they slightly different issues. I think in terms of Ofcom, the problem is that most of Ofcom's work, the work that really generates all the revenue effectively, is in telecoms. Whereas the government's search has been very focused on trying to get the right media or person in. And I suspect that what probably happened was that Ian Livingstone, I believe, who I've got a lot of time for, a conservative peer, was on the panel, the board, who was what used to be chief executive and chairman of BT, probably realised that the people that had been put up were totally unsuited to be able to chair a very broad-based Ofcom, which took account of the 2/3 or more of the business, which was in telecommunications. I think that's the problem. They had a wonderful chair in Lord Burns, and you kind of got to ask yourself why he wasn't renewed. He was an excellent chair, and I've worked with him as a chair, as best chair I've ever worked under. Sorry. In terms of the ICO, which I think is what Lucy's referring to, she's fantastic. We had probably the best ICO in the world in Liz Denham. I think that her role was made very difficult. I think she probably became quite disillusioned, and I think the government didn't want her to be as independent and as tough as her brief required her to be. So I think, again, there's an element of convenience there. I don't think Liz Wenham particularly wanted to go, but the position was created whereby there wasn't a lot of point in her staying. So in both cases, I'm afraid I point a finger at the government, who are seeking a specific preference in both those roles.
So is that nakedly political in your view?
It's wholly political, not Karis, not a little bit. And that's the problem. You know, we in the UK certainly throughout my political life, have played it very fair. I mean, I've served on any number of public bodies, and the way in which the boards are put together, the chairs have been put together, have been relatively, I would argue, apolitical. That's the rules of engagement have changed in politics in a way that I find very disturbing.
Just to add to that, we're also waiting for a kind of new permanent chair at the CMA as well. So, you know, again, this is a body that not just in the digital field, but also when it comes to state aid and so on, you know, huge numbers of new responsibilities are being placed on it. And we're not quite sure what the overall direction is, but I agree. I think there is a kind of political aspect to that.
And Hugh, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree as well. I also think that what we're seeing is politicians talking up what some of these organizations are capable of beyond what they're actually capable of, which then makes them it makes it very hard for them to actually deliver against these artificially raised expectations of what they're going to be able to achieve. And we certainly see that around some of the rhetoric around the online harms, for example, where, you know, frankly, Ofcom is going to be handed something that's going to be incredibly hard to deliver on some of the slightly outlandish ministerial expectations of what the bill will achieve. And it makes it really very hard for a regulator to be able to deliver, you know, against and be successful. So actually, what I'm kind of cautioning there is actually a bit of reality and of setting expectations at the right kind of level in as much as organizations can then have a half chance of delivering against them.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question here. I think this one's anonymous. It's, could the panel comment on the events that we saw in Australia with their new legislation on paying for news content and how each of the actors, Google, Facebook, the government, came out of the situation? Who was it really a win for? I don't know who'd want to take that first. Is that one for you, Michelle?
I can start us off. I imagine others might be kind of closer to how it's played out since. I would say that my understanding is that it was primarily a win for Rupert Murdoch, and that actually, you know, this was about kind of rearranging the deck chairs a little bit, kind of having an agreement that was government backed, that would allow for a kind of new settlement of that kind of revenue sharing. And, you know, Hugh, I think, mentioned the need for an ongoing fairer distribution of revenue between publishers, and Emma's obviously touched on that as well in terms of the level playing field. My understanding is that the Australian situation has not kind of achieved that, but it has kind of done quite well for those who are able to kind of get to that negotiating table quickly enough and who are kind of big enough to matter, really. But others may have a different perspective.
Should I just jump in quickly? I mean, I think you're right, Michelle, actually. I think in many respects, the winners so far are Facebook, Google, and Rupert Murdoch. I do think that what worked about it was creating an incentive to have a discussion, and whether or not that's been very effective in solving some of the problems that still remain, including, frankly, for small media outlets, it really is yet to be seen. And the kind of terms of the legislation have yet to kick in because the negotiations have now have taken place. But still, I don't think it's solved systemically the issue. And the issue is still there, which is that you know, you can fund local media with sort of handouts, but still systemically, the market is broken. And if an organization or set of organizations can only be functional with handouts, then something's wrong fundamentally. And I don't think that the Australian legislation has fixed that. And the honest truth is that I don't have any real solutions as to how to fix it more effectively. I mean, I had a conversation with the Australian regulator and asked what advice she would give to UK government as the UK government embarks on the same journey. And I think she was scratching her head as much as everyone else is about how do we really solve this and how do we make it put the local news industry on a more sustainable footing.
I would agree entirely with all that. I mean, the winners were the incumbents on both sides of that discussion. I'm not aware of any money finding its way to ABC television or the public broadcaster, which that could have actually been an alleviating factor. But I was going to mention a tiny story, a very short story. Lord Beaverbrook, at the very height of his powers in the late 1940s, was involved in quite difficult trade negotiations with the unions, and to the amazement of the rest of his board, said in the end, pay the men whatever they want. And the board said, well, no, why are you doing that? He said, because the competition can't afford it. What he knew he was doing was by setting a price for printing, particularly it was a printer strike, by setting the price high, that was going to hurt him, but it was going to hurt his competition much more. And I'm afraid that that's what happens when you're dealing with really large incumbents. They can take hits that no one smaller can bear.
I think that's a really important point. Unfortunately, we're still struggling with Emma's internet connection, but she does say that she agrees, particularly with what Michelle was saying there.
Harris, can I just go back on Lord Putnam on the point you just made? Does that mean that you think it's inevitable that there needs to be a certain amount of public subsidy?
Without any doubt at all. If you want public information publicly available, then it's going to be publicly subsidized. And sooner or later, we should all come to terms with the fact that that's the only way we're going to protect democracy. Because you will not protect democracy through market-driven competition. It's a fantasy.
That leads us nicely into a couple of questions that we have here. I'm going to read both of them out so that you can consider them. One is from Catherine Johnson, and she asked, to what extent is competition policy able to address the problems of platform power? Yesterday, Ben Scott argued that breaking up the platforms doesn't address the underlying business incentive based on the extraction of data, which is the source of concentrated power in the market. What are the panel's thoughts on whether policy needs to focus more on data rather than just competition? And then there's another question here from Debs Grayson. She asks, I wonder what the panelists think about the potential or need for publicly owned digital platforms, such as ideas for a British digital corporation, a public service search engine, and so on. How would this change the terrain, and have we missed that window when these could be viable challenges given the power of tech monopolies now? I don't know who'd like to start with those. Michelle, is that you coming off mute?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. No, I was readying myself, but I don't need to leap on first. If you'd rather somebody else go first. No. Okay. So I'll tackle aspects of those, the ones that I kind of know a little bit about, and I'll leave others to pick up the other points. In terms of this question about competition policy, is it able to deal with the problems of platform power? I think one of the things that troubles me about a lot of our discussion here, but also the wider discussion, is that it takes the power of the existing monopolists as a given, and it does very little to kind of challenge that. Effectively says that, you know, they are part of the furniture, we must adapt, and therefore we must think about the negotiating power vis-a-vis those existing platforms. That's why I mentioned in my opening remarks this point about the pro-competitive interventions that the government is considering. You know, what are the powers that the new Digital Markets Unit should have? Because the Furman Review and the Online Markets ad study that was done by the CMA both recommended the potential powers around business separation, line of business separation, winding back previous mergers, looking at breaking up Facebook and Google along the ad supply chain. So these are solutions that may very well be politically unviable. So that's maybe why they're being pushed off the table. But I think there needs to be a discussion about the kind of prevailing power of the incumbents, and are we happy with that settlement? On the question of British digital corporation, I see public investment as a way to create those other alternatives. Currently, users, you know, people using the service of Facebook or of Google do not have an alternative. So that power will never be challenged, really, if you are always going to kind of allow for the kind of sanctity of that monopoly. And I think that goes to very deeply to a lot of our notions of entrepreneurship, private property. What are the rightful gains of the entrepreneur? You know, just because you create something that grows to be huge, is that, you know, should that be kind of protected no matter what? So I think that we should be thinking about those deeply within competition policy, but also this, to Catherine's question, we should be thinking about we don't just want any type of competition. It matters how companies compete. So currently we have this kind of shareholder value, profit maximization at, profits at all costs model of competition that's also kind of entrenched within corporate governance and corporate law. So, companies would say we have really no other choice. Our shareholders are breathing down our neck, saying, where are the next quarter's revenues coming from? And if we're not going to present them with another opportunity to effectively kind of exploit the value chain between publisher, between advertiser, between content provider and the consumer, then where is the future revenue coming from? And so I think this is really fundamentally goes down to kind of how do we think companies should be allowed to act within the UK market? What is the type of competition that we think we want to be encouraging? And that feeds in, I think, to all of these other conversations that we're having about what's the acceptable level of power, how should that power be redistributed, and so on. So I'll let kind of others talk to the specifics around publishing, but just at a kind of competition policy level, I think, just to say that I suppose that those are conversations that are happening within the competition community, because it's not just it happening in digital and tech. We see the same questions being raised in agriculture. We see it in pharmaceuticals. We see it in banking. Again, agglomeration of power and a permission to extract from the rest of the value chain. And these are kind of fundamental questions, really.
Can I just ask you a very brief follow-up, which is how you view the desirability of breaking up platforms in the event that they are natural monopolies where there is value from actually having all that data held in one place?
So I think we have to be very clear about what we're going to break up, because, for example, some of the remedies are really around interoperability and data sharing and data portability. That doesn't require breaking up the corporate structure. It requires breaking open the data and the way that those companies operate. So it very much changes the business model without necessarily kind of breaking them up. On kind of corporate breakups, given that many of the companies grew big through what would now be considered illegal mergers. So, these are consolidation that was kind of passed through based on a very weak understanding of what competition policy should be doing. I see no problem of winding those back. And any company that says it's not possible to break us up, companies break themselves up all the time. They rid themselves of problematic divisions. It's entirely kind of operationally possible, or it should be. The caution that I would place there is that breakup is not enough. We have to do something about the pathways to monopoly that these companies have exploited that have allowed them to grow big in the first place. So if you just break them up, as we saw, the US famously broke up Standard Oil in the early 20th century, the kind of big breakup, and you have a kind of reconsolidation of many of the individual assets that were broken up, and many of those individual companies are still would be considered kind of oligopolies or monopolies or companies with market power. So the breakup alone isn't enough. You need to have this kind of very holistic understanding, which is why, it may have seemed like I was kind of being very nitpicking over the language that the government is using as it's setting out on this kind of brave agenda. But I think it's really important, actually, that we are all clear on the destination we're trying to get to. And I think that requires a very kind of open-minded and clear-sighted understanding of what types of competition we want and how we want companies to operate.
Thanks. Hugh?
It's super interesting. And I do wonder sometimes why some of the big tech companies don't learn a bit more from Standard Oil. It seems astonishing to me that there are so many lessons there about behaviors, and one of the things I think is quite reassuring is that there does seem to be, well, maybe it's too early to say, but I mean, certainly the approach that we have taken in respect of artificial intelligence and the ethics that we want to put in place around our development and deployment, use by ourselves and by our customers of artificial intelligence has really prompted us to think a bit more holistically about corporate behavior, full stop. And, if you apply the approach that we want to take around artificial intelligence, which is to say that is society enriched or better as a result of the use of this technology. And if we apply that to all of our business, rather than just the application of artificial intelligence, then actually we're getting somewhere, because we're saying we're putting in place a mechanism that says, do you know what, just because we can do this thing, whatever it is, that doesn't mean that we should do this thing, whatever it is. And actually having that ability to self-moderate and say, this acquisition or this strategy or this approach actually isn't a net benefit to all of society, so we're not going to do it, is an approach that increasingly, shareholders in looking for ESG measures and increasingly looking at an organization's purpose and the way that it functions and its sense of responsibility, I think is encouraging. I mean, I would say that because it's something that we're doing, but I do still think it's encouraging. I would stop there, but I'm just going to say one other thing, which is, one of the things that came out of the Jason Furman review, and certainly in terms of the way we're thinking about the DMU and the application of the strategic market status, is that platforms are different, and you can't apply the same rules to all the platforms. And so, for example, Facebook and Google are very different. There are a multitude of search engines that you could choose from. And the barriers to choosing a different search engine are actually very low. I mean, it's just a question of what you plug into the browser. And the challenge is that one search engine has become ubiquitous, and it's now a kind of a verb as well as a noun, and so that's created this order. But there is competition out there. I mean, we also have a search engine, although our market status is considerably less, but there are a range of search engines out there to use. Facebook is slightly different, and there is it interacts in a very different way with its users. Snapchat is different again. So you've kind of, it's very difficult to define SMS in one go, in one way. And the other thing, of course, is that you can have a very small tech company with a very large platform. And so you have this very, kind of a disconnect between the size and resources and ability of a company to be able to put in place the kind of governance procedures that a big platform can. And yet in its social media presence, for example, it could be disproportionately large, which then creates, unusual behaviors in terms of how you regulate as well.
Can I just come in just very quickly just to respond to one of those points, which is that Hugh, you kind of talked about this kind of the ethics that Microsoft is hoping to inject into AI and the kind of self-restraint almost that we would want to see from kind of responsible businesses. And I think that goes back to kind of the comments that I made earlier and that you picked up on around Microsoft being battle scarred from kind of a substantial antitrust scrutiny and, falling, almost being broken up really at the end of the 90s and early 2000s. And I think the point there is that enormous case that was brought by the competition authorities wasn't then followed up by decades of other cases. In fact, it thoroughly put them off, and they didn't really do another big one. They haven't really done another big one since the latest cases that are now being brought against Facebook, Amazon, and Google. And I think the point there is that actually, the lesson kind of wasn't learned, because actually, Facebook was only formed as a company, a few years later, and into a kind of very open territory. And so I think the point that I'm trying to make is that we can't really just look at the problem that's in front of us. We need to kind of take a stance towards this type of problem and keep kind of like whack-a-mole. You have to kind of keep going. You can't just kind of hit one over the head and be done with it. You never get to a point where this market dynamic is solved. It's a constant dynamic between the private sector and the public sector and the state and democracy. And this is something we have to kind of constantly safeguard, even more so in the digital era.
There's also how you define that market. So we went from around 98% market share in operating system and almost overnight to about 14%. market share in operating system because of the rise of different technologies that had a completely different operating system. And so actually, you're absolutely right. It's how do you disconnect the operation of the market from very specific and narrow technology or solutions or platforms or whatever. And I think that's exactly right.
I just want to bring Lord Putnam in on this question.
Thanks, Harris. Yes, I mean, first of all, Hugh, in a sense, answered his, or there is an answer to his very early question, which is called the public interest test. It's on the statute book. It's only really been used once, or thoroughly tested once, and it was successful. So Michelle will know why the public interest test isn't used more often, or why the ways in which it might be able to broaden to encompass other aspects of the media landscape. Data-driven was one question. So data-driven growth, as I see it, is just an accelerator. It's a huge accelerator and very, very difficult to get your head around. But I'm old enough to be a child of, and the Treasury hate this, of levies and the notion of hypothecated taxes. If we really want the information system we desire, there's enough money sloshing around in the system to hypothecate, to levy and then hypothecate that money into the information systems we most like. And the last thing I'd say here is, if someone came through the door today, Karis, I promise you, and suggested what actually is the formula of the BBC and the funding of the BBC, people would write white coats around them and carry them off screaming to a lunatic asylum. But we did it. And one of the problems, of course, the government's got is that BBC is at a size now, it can't get rid of it. So all it can do is salami slice it. But the concept of the BBC was brilliant. But in today's world of the assumptions we base today's world on, it's impossible to replicate. It shouldn't be that way.
I think that's an important point. And there are interesting proposals out there for how you could democratically distribute public money to ensure viable, high quality journalism. Some people may have read Tom Mills's book, for instance, on this, which is very interesting. I think we're almost running short on time, just because we did raise public interest at the end there. There's a question from Damien, which is one key question, whether and to what extent it will be possible to devise a special public interest regime, for example, in relation to media. The current Enterprise Act regime is based on definitions of newspapers, and there is a separate regime for broadcasters that depends on licensing. Do we need a new approach to media plurality or a new policy objective?
Short answer is yes. I mean, the present regime was formulated because we weren't allowed to invade the digital domain, because the Blair government at the time felt that would suppress innovation and development. That was the only reason. So the idea of going back and looking at in a much wider sense at a regime which morally, I would argue, maybe the wrong word, is sensible, but has not been applied to this wider marketplace. Yes, it's an overwhelming case.
Thanks. And Emma, was that you trying to come in there?
I was trying to. Can you hear me?
We can. Brilliant.
Yay! I've been on and off. The route has been on and off. Anyway, I need to lie down after this. I do apologise. Yeah, I mean, I just think a big bugbear of mine, and anybody's heard me speak before, I'm a huge advocate in saying we need to stop talking about newspapers and start talking about news publishers. I think even the word newspaper doesn't help anybody at all. And that then it still fits into these archaic laws and legislations we have where, are you print or are you digital? We need to start talking about news publishers, and we need to start looking about engagement, impact, reach, and size and scale. Bigger is not always better, because again, what we lose is plurality of voice. What we need is plurality of voice. Every community is different, and if you have one size fits all, which we see with some of these large news media organizations, where you'll get one story that's not, well, I was going to say semi-adapted. It isn't adapted at all, really. It's just kind of just shoved out to various communities across the UK, and that's where we start losing interest. And once you start losing interest, then we start getting people just saying, well, I read it on Facebook or I read it on Twitter, and not really understanding the difference between, whether it's from a verified news publisher or whether it's from social media. So I think this is a really big issue that we have not got to grips with in the UK at all. Coming back to this Hands, Face, Space campaign, why should it be a difference between a news publication, whether it's printed or digital? And somebody asked a question in the comments whether I'm saying this was money for the old guard, absolutely. You know, there's no other reason for it whatsoever. So we've just done a trial, and they chose 4 of our members for a trial, a digital trial, and all we've had is one line come back and say it's not financially viable. We don't know why. We've had no explanation, we've had no remit, we've had absolutely nothing. But why are we differentiating in this day and age between whether something goes out in print or whether it goes out in digital? We need to be looking at, as I say, reach and opportunities. Coming back to what Debs was asking about, you know, the British Digital Public Service Search Engine. I think the thing here is the same as everything, is about education. Why do people need to use it? I think unless people understand, you know, we can create these things, but unfortunately we don't live in a Kevin Costner film where the key line was, if you build it, they will come. I think we need to look at where we've got audiences. How can we build on plurality of voice? How can we build on diversity? Diversity is something that's so important. And when you have a one size fits all, then you start to lose diversity. And these are all things for a vibrant future we need to be considering. But again, it comes down to education. Why do I need to be going to a quality and reputable news publisher as opposed to Facebook? So a friend and colleague, Dr. Rachel Howells, did a whole thesis on what happens to a community when there's a news desert, a news black hole. She focused on Port Talbot and what happens to that community when they lose a dedicated news source and rely solely on Facebook. And then you get Chinese whispers and you get, you know, just it is not proper accurate news. And before you know it, somebody's seen, you know, when somebody's come off a motorbike on the side of the road, you know, within 10 messages, there was a donkey, there were 3 aliens and a helicopter above, because that's what happens when you don't have a journalist to bring that information together. So I think it's really important that all these ideas are fantastic, but again, it comes down to education. I think we need to be teaching children about the importance of journalism, and not only because we're trying to create journalists of the future, because we know that not everybody in the class is going to be interested in becoming a journalist, but to understand the value to create engaged citizens of the future. So we don't start teaching engagement with news and the value and the importance of it now, then children and young people growing up with these digital platforms will not understand the value of news, and then we really will never get the genie back in the bottle.
Very important point, thank you. Michelle, did you want to come in on this? And I'll ask you to include any closing remarks.
Sure, yeah. I mean, just on the point that Emma was making, I think that say in my generation, you know, I think there's a common understanding that, you know, Facebook is this dying app that nobody really uses anymore, and that it's really just our kind of mums that are still on Facebook. But that point where Facebook becomes the sole news source, that is actually the situation in many countries around the world. You know, countries which have kind of leapfrogged over Google even, and you know, the app that you get on your phone when you buy it from the newsagent is Facebook, and that's where you're getting all of your information from. That is the situation we obviously want to avoid, where Facebook effectively becomes your kind of public news broadcaster. On the public interest test, I mean, the point around the public interest test is we used to have a public interest test in the UK before the Competition Act of 1998. That was it was rife for ministerial intervention and kind of politicking over mergers, which is one of the reasons why it was removed. We retained a public interest test only when a minister kind of intervenes on the specific grounds. You know, one was the financial crisis, but media plurality is another. I think we need to think again about reinserting the public interest into the kind of overriding statutory duty, and that would bring in all of the types of issues that we're talking about. It is a problematic area, it needs a lot of careful thought. I don't think we can go into it with our eyes closed, but we need to have a much broader understanding of what are the implications of mergers, and what are the powers of this digital markets unit, and how will they be interpreted?
Thank you. Hugh.
No, I have I participated in a number of these debates on this topic, and there's always been a lot of admiring the problem, and we've come away at the end of the discussion having really admired the problem, and I think what's really interesting is that what this discussion has really shown for me is that we're beginning to see elements of solutions as well as the problem, and I think that's really reassuring. I think what Emma has talked about a little earlier about this outsized value of local news and local journalism. It was so eloquent and so accurate, and we do have to find a way of protecting it. And I do think that there's some really interesting ideas emerging about how that might work. Certainly, there's no model that you can look at around the world that is effective, and so I think we haven't got there yet in terms of the actual proposals on the table. But I do think that, frankly, the kind of discussion that this has, that IPPR and Oxford Media Convention is nurturing here, is exactly the right kind of discussion. And if we can just have the discussion a bit more often and a bit more as eloquently as it has been today, I think we might actually have some great opportunities to make a difference.
I always like to end on an optimistic note. So it falls to me just to say thank you for being part of this conversation. It's been hugely informative and interesting for me. I think one thing that comes through really clearly is that we need more people to be thinking about and talking about this rather than fewer. And that includes people beyond the technocrats who might be considering this, who can think about the bigger picture, and also involving people if we really want the new regime that emerges to serve democratic interests. So really very grateful to all of our speakers, particularly grateful to Microsoft for sponsorship of the session. Very grateful to all of you for watching and for asking questions. Please don't miss our next and final session of Oxford Media Convention, which is at 4:15, when we'll be discussing the potential sell-off of Channel 4, which should be a lively debate. And if you are able to, then please do join us for drinks in central London tonight, which will be outside, be as safe as possible.